Okay, hello, this is Chris McElligott Park, and I am going to be showing, uh, well, this is mainly for modders, but I'm going to be showing off some of the new code and how to convert your existing code mod to fit in what is being called, what I'm referring to as the Great Refactor. This has been 3 weeks of intensive work, and there's still bugs and things that I need to get sorted out in the main code base, but we're on the beta branch right now. And but the overall goal of this is to bring a new kind of structure to the game. It's meant to make it a lot easier for you as a modder into the future. And it's also meant to make it much less likely that there will be, in particular, a multiplayer error in code that you write that is not also a single player error, if that makes sense. So, because all of us rarely have time to just sit down and extensively. When we're going to test, we're going to sit down, we're going to test what we're working on right then. Does it work? Yes or no? And we don't have time to get out a second computer and test it with ourselves, or hop on with some other players and see what goes on with them. More likely than not, if you're hearing about bugs in your code in multiplayer, you're hearing from people who are actually experiencing those bugs as they play multiplayer. They're trying to just have a good time, and part of their good time is being messed up by the fact there was a bug in your code, or my code, our code, as it may be. So we want to reduce that. There's also some weirdness in the way that the data was being stored for external data to begin with. External data being most of what is our AI and most of the details of the simulation, honestly. Keith and I had started with some of that more internally and then moved increasingly externally on that. So I've moved everything. And that's going to take a little bit of getting used to if you're already used to it from before. If you are new and you're planning on starting a code mod for the first time, then this is a lot less daunting than trying to translate something existing. So what I'm going to talk about is translating something existing more so than anything else. It took me, just on the external data stuff, it took me, I don't even know, it would have been this stuff. So it took me 5 days before it would compile, and these were like 12-hour days, and then it took me another 3 days to get rid of all the runtime errors, and even that's not all of the runtime errors. So that was for 3 DLCs in the entire base game, and I was also learning how to do it at the first time, and I also had to invent a bunch of new data structures in order to do those things. But it should be much quicker with other mods, even with somebody as prodigious in their output as Sir Lembo. So let's take a look first. I just want to show you around a couple of things I want to point out in the main code base before I show you how to break down. I'm going to do part of Sir Lembo's AMU mod, and I'm going to do part of Starkelp's civilian industries. And those haven't been converted yet, but the main code base has, and I'll show you a few things. So for one thing, if you do a search, a global search for teaching moment, you will come up with a bunch of different topics in a bunch of different files. These are mostly things that I wrote. There are a few that are actually things that Badger wrote that I flagged as a teaching moment. But the idea is these show you how to do a lot of different things, or they explain why something has to happen a certain way. And so these explain, usually in the first line, at least something like, oh, this one's about ThreadStatic. Do you not know what ThreadStatic is? A year and a half ago, I didn't know what ThreadStatic was. Turns out, as I wrote, it's magical. And you can do a lot of things with ThreadStatic. That's what I get for not reading the C# APIs as deeply as I had for a while. I mean, I used to devour the C# APIs, I mean, up through 2 point something. And then they started moving into all this stuff with LINQ. And I was like, okay, they've jumped the shark. They're starting to turn this into SQL Server. And I can't tell what's going on, what a LINQ query is going to do from turning code into bytecode, my code into bytecode. And I don't like that because I want to have the conveniences of modern language and garbage collector and all that sort of stuff. But I want to have an understanding of what is happening on the processor from the code that I write. And that's generally my ethos. And so I lost interest in the later versions of .NET, and I stopped reading their stuff in detail. And then Keith was still reading various things, and showed me like an anonymous methods, and I was big into generics, and there were some other things though that some tricks that were coming out that were in the 3.0 and 3.5 .NET, and then 4.0, 4.5. They're in like C# 8 now. And turns out when you ignore something like that for about 15 years, aside from all the overblown stuff that, in my opinion, is still questionable, if you're a programmer who wants to know how their code translates into bytecode and then machine code, I love SQL Server, but I don't want SQL type syntax in my runtime code. So at any rate, there were things that I missed. And if you're old like me and old school, or there's a lot of reasons you could have missed some things too. So I mentioned some things that are particularly helpful. And then I've got some other things where I explain some of the limitations that I ran into and how to solve various problems. So first of all, let's define what we're talking about here. Actually, there's a great teaching moment in here somewhere or other that talks about the entire threading model. Interlocked.Exchange is another one that is a humongous benefit, which I just learned about this year. And I don't remember what year they added it, but it basically, all the old school textbooks that, used to have on threading, there's a bunch of new tools. And so I have built tools on top of those tools. So that's enough rambling in general, but I'm coming from the ethos of wanting to be able to understand where data is coming and going from, and not having a bunch of waste. The garbage collector is nice, but we want to rely on that as little as possible for performance reasons, for not having GC hiccups, even though we now have a garbage collector over time that Unity's put in. It's still a good idea to not throw too much garbage. So we now have 2 DLLs where we used to have 1, and all of your projects will also have to be split. So you've got an external code, which is your BaseInfo, and then you've got a whatever you want to call it. I called mine external deep processing code, which is what I refer to as DeepInfo. I don't refer to those as base data or deep data, because there may be no actual data associated with one of the objects. They may just be a collection of information transforms, or essentially methods for making things happen. And they might be working variables, but variables that are not serialized. So in other words, data that exists in RAM for working with for a while, but it doesn't actually go to disk, or if it goes to disk and it's in DeepInfo of any sort, it only exists on the host. And the only reason we would save something to disk in DeepInfo is because the working variables are apparently so expensive to generate for some reason that we want to store what we've already generated and then reload that again. But it's not the sort of thing we're going to share with the client in multiplayer. And honestly, I have 0 instances of that because pretty much all working data is the sort of thing that we can regenerate in part of a second. And so the capability's there. If you've got some sort of crazy data that you need to serialize in DeepInfo, you can do it. I put methods there for it. But that's just kind of me being thorough. There's 3 different classes of data that we have here as well. There's data that can be attached to 3 different things, and it works a little bit differently each time. You have base and DeepInfo for the world itself, factions, and for squads. So a squad is a unit in general, so that could be a building, a ship, whatever. That's it. Those are the only 3 things that have external data. In our old external data stuff, we could attach things to planets. Nobody actually used that. You could attach stuff to player profiles. Again, went unused. And there was something else we could attach it to as well, but it was not useful. So I looked at what everybody was actually using and went with that. Now, the ability to attach stuff to the world was very rarely used before, but you should use it now. In AMU, Sir Limbo has a thing that he calls the fake executor faction. He and I were chatting about that on Discord yesterday, and the idea is we're going to split that. So part of his fake executor faction is going to become world data and not a faction at all, and that would be present all the time. I'm going to show you an example of that sort of data. So this is in the main base info, and I've got this sorted out by base game and then DLCs just for organization's purpose. We used to have all of this sort of thing inside individual files. I'm sorry, inside one big long file, which is, that strikes me as a very C++ way to do it, where your header files and stuff, have a lot of, the more header files you have, the longer compile time is and all that sort of stuff. And so you try and minimize the number of files you have and try to change your headers as infrequently as possible and, that sort of thing. C# doesn't have any of those limitations. It doesn't matter if you've got 1 file or 10,000 files, it compiles in the same amount of time, pretty much. What matters is the amount of code you have. That's what changes things. So files, therefore, are purely for organizational purposes and you being able to find something. And so being able to use Visual Studio to its fullest extent and actually search for things is really helpful. And so if I type world in here and hit enter, then you'll notice that this does show me inside files the actual classes, and it shows me even the properties and so forth in there. So I don't have to have these split out into separate files in order to make it discoverable, but it's so much easier a lot of times to understand the organization of something, especially if you don't know what the word is you're searching for. If you're just like want to kind of browse around and see what's going on, being able to do that at the file level is really useful. So I split this largely for teaching purposes and so that people who don't understand what the code base is can come and look at it more at a glance. I wouldn't say fully at a glance, but it's getting close. So you'll notice we've got this folder that's got base info in general. You can kind of guess what's in there. It's a lot of base info for factions and squads and things. There's some fire team stuff in there too. I guess fire teams must be base info of some sort. We've got this whole description appender section, which is for adding to tooltips, basically. We've got external DeepLink definitions. That is an unusual thing, and that basically that is a super cool feature. It's explained in a teaching moment. It's also explained in the release notes, and it's beyond the scope of this video. But if you feel like there's not enough power for you to mimic adding a new feature like we would in core, this is where that power probably is going to come from. So it lets you define something that has your own semantic style. Apparently it is in the scope of this video, geez. So for instance, for mapgen, I wanted our base code to be able to seed Warden secret ninja hideouts. So that was just the name that we had for Warden bases way back in the day. We called them secret ninja hideouts. It used to be in the main base info code, because everything was base info. So in the main code that was all just external, we were able to call mapgen stuff. That's now a DeepInfo thing only. The reason why is twofold. One, mapgen only ever happens on the host. And two, it's a non-UI thing. And so it's generating a map, and there is not a part of that process that's displayed on the UI. The end result affects data that's in base info, absolutely. But map generation itself, the process of generating a map, is just kind of like, wait, please, and then it gives you back some information. The problem with moving that into DeepInfo only came up once, it turns out, in the whole code base, is that Warden's one specific flavor of Warden needed to be able to seed its own secret ninja hideouts. And I can right click on this and hit find all references. And so I can go and see exactly where that is. So specifically, in the starting game logic for Wardens in general, and man, I could go on for hours about how this code is structured and why. I don't mean to self-praise, but this is really, really well done. And the principle of encapsulation applies at all levels. So what that means is, right, depending on, whoever you are watching this, you may have more or less of a computer science background, but the important aspect of encapsulation, from my perspective, is that you are in a finite context. So if we're talking about people, for instance, you walking around, you see other people, and you see the outside of them. You don't see what's in their brains. You don't see their internal organs, all that sort of stuff. The internal parts of a person are encapsulated to you. Now, if you're a surgeon, you can go and you can open up part of the person, and there's ways to go in. If you are a gastroenterologist, you can stick a scope down the person's throat and examine their stomach. There's ways you can get around encapsulation that are more or less destructive depending on what you're doing, and sometimes that's necessary. But the idea is to try and not have that be required generally. Instead, you have public interfaces, such as if you want to know what's in a person's brain, that interface would be talking to them. It's their mouth, and so you go and you talk to them, and your public interface for hearing what they're saying back is your eyes and your ears, right? So encapsulation keeps it so that we're not like seeing X-ray vision of everything around us and accidentally messing stuff up. Because, right now I'm able to talk to you and you're hearing me and you're looking at what I'm seeing on the screen here, but at no point am I like directly putting my fingers in your brain and messing stuff around. Like, that wouldn't be good. There's a protective layer between the information I can give you and you understanding it, because you're going to take it in through your ears and your brain, and you're going to parse it how you want to parse it, and you're going to do with that information what you do with it. I don't have knowledge of what you're going to do with that information, and that's important. I know how to give you information, and I know how I would handle dealing with the information I'm giving you, but it's not up to me to do that. It's up to you. And the same principle applies with all of these sections of code. And when I refer to idiot proofing, that's kind of what I refer to, because you're your own human being. If I were to go messing around in your brain and tried to insert knowledge that I think you should have in a very direct fashion, there's a very good chance that I'm going to screw up your memories of your mother, or make some sort of conflicting. You have a very different philosophy on programming or something, and I'm going to screw up the integration of this new knowledge that I am imparting to you. And knowledge, that sounds, it's information, the information that I'm passing to you. You know what I mean? And so that's the idea. This particular code here knows it wants some secret warden bases. It knows how many it wants. It's figuring that out here. It says, I want some number based on the context at the moment. MapGen, give me that many. And that's the end of it. On the other end, MapGen, if I just do a search for this, I can find the implementation. The reason that didn't show up in the references is because this is in DeepInfo. On the other end, MapGen says, you were asking me for a warden secret ninja hideout. I know what you mean by that. How many do you want? Okay, that many. What faction? Okay, cool. That's the only information I need from you to carry out your request. Here's the call. That's the call that used to be on the other end. So this normally would not be allowed, because normally BaseInfo can't do map generation stuff, because that's been encapsulated in DeepInfo. There's this one exception in the code. So I could get kind of hacky and work like an old school modder. There's two kinds of modders, okay? There's the modders like I used to be, where, because I have a background in modding and I have a background in ROM hacking too. And there's, when you don't have the permission of the company that has made a product, then you have to kind of get tricky and you have to get hacky and you have to kind of work around whatever they've put there for you. This is not two-way communication. You take the product that they have and you alter it the way you want to. And if they change the nature of their product, then you've got to update, the nature of your thing. That's what I would consider kind of like hostile modding. It doesn't mean they don't like modders, but they might not. Grand Theft Auto 5 would be a good example of where, there's a modding scene, but it's kind of contentious, right? But that's modding style number one. And I don't want that relationship between the code here and any modders. We don't want that, because it leads to weird workarounds, inefficiencies. It leads to breaking encapsulation. And that weird example I gave of passing information, accidentally messing up the relationship with your mother or whatever, that sort of thing happens with game data because something changes or a modder doesn't understand what something is supposed to be. And it's not idiot proof. It's doing bare brain surgery. So the second way of modding is to have an interface that is prepared in advance. And this is collaborative modding, where I don't know what you're going to do. You could do something I very much disagree with, and I'm cool with that. That's part of how it goes. It's not for me to control, but I want to be able to provide the interfaces for you to go through with whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, essentially. So to pass data around, to make factions work, to do, whatever it is that needs to have happen. So if you find yourself trying to do something hacky in an antagonistic way, I don't really mean like you and I are antagonistic, but I mean in that style of modding, please ask me for an interface instead, because I would much prefer doing that, because it'll just keep your code more sane, and it eliminates the risks of weird incompatibilities in the future if I happen to change something. So this is a good example of an exception and me internally needing to make a punch through for something that normally wouldn't be allowed. Normally the BaseInfo code can't say something about how it wants to seed stuff. It's almost never necessary. The map generation code in DeepInfo looks at BaseInfo and makes decisions based on that, but the decisions are all in DeepInfo. I could have recoded this to work that same way, but there's a risk in the short term, because I'm translating all this code over, of me introducing new bugs by doing that. So I chose not to, and to instead just make a punch through. So that's what these DeepLinks are, is you being able to punch through from BaseInfo to DeepInfo and make a call that you would not otherwise be able to make. Now, if you're considering making a DeepLink, you need to think about, is that something you actually want to do? Like, is it necessary, or can your code be refactored so that Deep looks at Base and makes a choice rather than Base directing what Deep does? Because the more deep links we have, the more risks we have for kind of circular logic and other weird situations that can come up. And so it's a very powerful tool to have, but kind of know not when not to use it, But certainly if you're translating a mod right now and there's stuff you need to translate across, I don't expect you to spend hours or days refactoring something just because. Make a deep link, be done with it, So, these sort of tools are here for a reason. If I didn't provide a tool that you do need, then also let me know. I think I thought of most things, but I'm not omniscient. So, we have, for factions, circling back around, factions all have BaseInfo and DeepInfo. They must. It's non-optional, non-negotiable. Every faction has a single BaseInfo and DeepInfo. It's put onto them very, very early. It can be empty. It's fine. So we have a thing called a missing faction. It doesn't do anything. It just attaches itself and then makes a link. I like to do this each time to the BaseInfo, which also does nothing. It's empty. Excuse me. Makes for a nice little template class if you want to have one. Actually, let's take a look at this, because this is a nice little template to look at. So I'm going to split this into multiple videos because that's easier than giving you timestamps.